In 1914, Russia possessed 1,311 tons of gold, the third largest reserve on Earth. Only the United States and France held more. By 1920, Soviet authorities could account for roughly $50 million worth. The rest had vanished. This was not theft in the night by a single mastermind. This was a financial hemorrhage across 3 continents. Foreign banks in Tokyo, London, and New York absorbed portions. Frozen lakes swallowed train cars. Warlords in fur coats pocketed ingots. Czech soldiers, stranded thousands of miles from home, allegedly stashed crates in their luggage. Japanese colonels signed receipts they never intended to honor. The official story says most of the gold returned to Bolshevik hands. The official story is the first lie. Welcome to Noob Historian. We follow the money, trace the power, and expose the history they never taught you in school. Here is what makes this story more than a century-old mystery. In 2022, Western nations froze approximately $300 billion in Russian central bank assets following the invasion of Ukraine. By early 2026, those assets remain locked in European and American institutions. Russia responded by accumulating physical gold reserves and selling portions to cover budget shortfalls. The Russian central bank held gold valued at over $384 billion in February 2026. The playbook has not changed. Sovereign wealth stored abroad becomes a hostage the moment geopolitics shifts. Physical gold held domestically becomes untouchable. The lessons of 1917 echo in boardrooms and central banks today. The 1917 gold disappearance was not a single event. It was a cascade of decisions, betrayals, and accidents that scattered an empire's wealth across the globe. To understand where the gold went, you need to understand the infrastructure of chaos that made its disappearance possible. Before the revolution, Russia stored its gold reserves across several western cities: Warsaw, Riga, Kiev, and Petrograd. The German advance in World War I changed that calculation. Between January and February 1915, Tsarist officials ordered a massive relocation. The gold would travel east, away from the front lines, to Kazan and Nizhny Novgorod. Kazan sat on the Trans-Siberian Railroad, roughly 640 kilometers east of Moscow. The city served as a commercial hub where European Russia met Siberia. The gold rested in the vaults of the Kazan branch of the state bank, guarded by soldiers who believed the war would end and normal life would resume. That belief died with the October Revolution of 1917. The Bolsheviks seized Petrograd. They inherited control over most of the gold that remained in the capital. But the situation in the Volga region was different. Anti-Bolshevik forces held strong positions. The gold in Kazan sat in contested territory. By August 1918, the Bolsheviks recognized their vulnerability. They ordered an evacuation of the Kazan gold to safer territory. They acted too late. Colonel Vladimir Kapel commanded White Army forces closing on the city. Fighting alongside Kapel was the Czechoslovak Legion, a unit of former prisoners of war who had served in the Austro-Hungarian army. These Czechs and Slovaks had switched sides to fight against their former empire. Now they found themselves trapped in Russia, cut off from home by the revolution, seeking any path back to Europe. On August 7, 1918, Kapel's forces captured Kazan. The Bolsheviks managed to evacuate only 4.6 tons of gold before the city fell. The rest remained in the bank vaults. Kapel sent a telegram to Colonel Stanislav Čeček, commander of the Penza Group of the Czechoslovak Corps. The message documented what they had found. Gold reserves valued at 650 million rubles, 100 million rubles in credit instruments, and additional gold and platinum bars. At the pre-war exchange rate, one gold Imperial ruble equaled roughly 20 modern US dollars. The colonel understood the stakes. Whoever controlled this gold would finance their side of the Civil War. Weapons, uniforms, soldiers, supplies. Everything required payment. Kapel ordered the immediate transport of the gold to safer White Army territory. The evacuation began. Steamships carried the gold from Kazan to Samara. From Samara, it moved to Ufa by rail. Then onward to Omsk, where Admiral Alexander Kolchak had established his government as the self-proclaimed supreme ruler of Russia. In May 1919, bank officials in Omsk conducted a careful audit. They confirmed the presence of gold worth approximately 650 million rubles. The reserve included coins from 14 nations: German marks, Greek drachmas, British sovereigns, American dollars, French francs, Japanese yen, and Chilean condors. The diversity reflected decades of international trade. This was the moment of maximum concentration. Nearly all of the captured gold sat in one location, under the control of one man. What happened next transformed a Civil War treasury into history's most documented case of sovereign wealth dispersal. Alexander Kolchak was a naval officer who found himself commanding land forces in a war without fronts. His government in Omsk controlled territory. It lacked international recognition from most nations. It desperately needed weapons and ammunition. The admiral turned to foreign powers: the United States, Great Britain, France, and Japan. Each of these nations had intervened in the Russian Civil War, deploying troops to various parts of the former empire. Their motivations varied. but all shared an interest in a non-Bolshevik Russia. They also shared an interest in payment for any assistance they provided. Kolchak began depositing gold in foreign banks as collateral for arms purchases. The transactions were documented. The gold left Russian territory with receipts and banking records. It would never return. To the Yokohama Currency Bank, Kolchak transferred 466 million gold rubles worth of gold and precious items. This deposit moved to the vaults of the State Bank of Japan. To the Tessen Ginko Bank, he transferred another 27,949,880 rubles. This sum was forwarded to the Bank of Japan in Osaka. The numbers tell their own story. Japan's gold reserves increased from 2,233 kilograms in 1918 to 25,105 kilograms in 1919, a tenfold increase in a single year. Much of that increase came directly from Russian vaults. General Sergei Rozanov, head of Kolchak's counterintelligence service, managed the negotiations with Japan. The weapons arrived. The gold stayed in Japanese vaults. The loans accumulated interest. The war continued to go poorly for the White Army. By late 1919, Kolchak's military situation had deteriorated beyond recovery. The Red Army advanced from the west. Supply lines stretched thin. Morale collapsed. On October 31st, 1919, Kolchak ordered the remaining gold loaded onto trains. Under heavy guard by his officers, the convoy would move east toward Irkutsk. The journey covered over 1,800 kilometers. The trains moved slowly through Siberian winter. Coal was scarce. Battles interrupted progress. The infrastructure, already strained by years of war, failed repeatedly. On December 27, 1919, the gold convoy arrived in Nizhneudinsk, still short of its destination. Representatives of the Allied powers met with Kolchak. They informed him his time had ended. Under pressure from French and British officers, the Admiral renounced his dictatorial powers. Control of the gold passed to the Czechoslovak Legion. The Czechs held the leverage now. They possessed the gold and they possessed the armed force to protect it. What they wanted was simple: safe passage out of Russia. The Czechoslovak Legion had spent years fighting to escape Russia. They numbered roughly 70,000 soldiers by 1918. They controlled stretches of the Trans-Siberian Railroad. They had demonstrated military competence throughout the Civil War, capturing Kazan and other cities. But they had no political stake in Russian affairs. They wanted to go home. The path home ran east to Vladivostok, where ships could carry them across the Pacific and eventually back to the newly independent Czechoslovakia. The Bolsheviks controlled territory between the Legion and its goal. The gold became a bargaining chip. On February 7, 1920, Czechoslovak commanders made their trade. They handed Admiral Kolchak over to the Bolsheviks in Irkutsk. Alongside the Admiral, they transferred 409 million rubles in gold. In exchange, the Bolsheviks guaranteed safe passage for the Legion through Russian territory. Kolchak was executed by firing squad shortly after his transfer. His body and that of his last prime minister were dropped through a hole in the ice of the frozen Angara River. The Bolsheviks received the gold and began sending it back west toward Kazan. Soviet records would later claim the treasure returned in its entirety. Historians dispute those numbers. The gold departed Kazan valued at 657 million rubles. The audit in Omsk recorded 651 million rubles. The transfer to the Bolsheviks totaled 409 million rubles. The arithmetic leaves a gap of approximately 240 million rubles. Some of that gap had documented explanations. Kolchak spent roughly 68 million rubles on weapons, uniforms, and military salaries. He deposited 128 million rubles in foreign banks for arms purchases, money that was never recovered. Those figures account for 196 million rubles. The remaining discrepancy has fueled a century of speculation. Suspicion fell immediately on the Czechoslovak Legion. The gold traveled under their protection for months. They had opportunity, they had motive. After returning to Czechoslovakia, several Legion officers participated in founding the Legio Bank, a financial institution that prospered in the interwar period. The bank's origins remained a source of rumor in Prague for decades. No definitive evidence has proven Czech theft of Russian gold. But the question persists. Did the soldiers who guarded the treasure help themselves to a portion of it? Local legends along the Trans-Siberian route offer another explanation. The tracks ran along Lake Baikal on a precarious stretch where the railroad clung to steep cliffs. Trains occasionally derailed. According to persistent oral histories, a train carrying gold plunged into the lake's kilometer-deep waters. In 2009, the Russian research submersible Mir explored Lake Baikal and discovered train wreckages at 700 meters depth. The crew reported seeing small objects glistening through sediment in a crevice. The submersible could not retrieve samples. The objects remain unidentified. The lake keeps its secrets. The Czech soldiers took their secrets to their graves. The official Soviet records maintained a convenient fiction. The true disposition of every ruble worth of gold will never be known with certainty. While Kolchak negotiated with the Entente powers and the Czechs transported gold along the main Trans-Siberian line, another player was extracting his share through more direct methods. Ataman Grigory Semenov controlled Transbaikalia. the region between Lake Baikal and the Manchurian border. He was 27 years old when the revolution began. The title Ataman marked him as a Cossack military leader, but Semenov operated more like a warlord than a conventional commander. His special Manchurian detachment included Transbaikalian Cossacks, officers, Serbian POWs, 2 Chinese infantry regiments, and a Japanese detachment under Captain Okamura. Semenov maintained an adversarial relationship with Admiral Kolchak. The admiral represented formal military hierarchy and discipline. The Ataman preferred independence and profit. They fought the same enemy but never became allies. In September 1919, Semenov's forces intercepted a train near Chita carrying 42 million rubles from Kolchak's gold fund. This was not theft from the Bolsheviks. This was seizure from the White Army's own treasury. Semenov justified the action as necessary for supplying his troops. He spent portions of the gold on weapons and uniforms. The rest he reserved for other purposes. The Ataman's primary foreign relationship was with Japan. The Japanese army had intervened in the Russian Civil War with 70,000 troops, the largest foreign contingent. They occupied portions of the Russian Far East and maintained a particular interest in Transbaikalia. Semenov served their purposes. They supplied his army. He paid in gold. In March 1920, Semenov transferred 33 boxes containing gold coins to the Japanese command in the port of Dalny. The shipment weighed approximately 1.5 tons. This gold was deposited in the chosen Ginkgo Bank. A portion was transferred to accounts held by General Mikhail Potyagin, who served as military attaché for Semenov's forces in Tokyo. Potyagin managed weapons purchases. The gold flowed through his accounts to Japanese suppliers. By October 1920, the People's Revolutionary Army of the Far Eastern Republic had pushed Semenov's forces into retreat. On October 22nd, the Semenovites evacuated Chita. The Ataman escaped by airplane to Harbin. His subordinates transported what remained of their gold reserves. In November 1920, Major General Pavel Petrov, head of the rear services for Semenov's Far Eastern Army, transferred the remaining gold to Colonel Izome of the Japanese military mission. The shipment included 20 boxes of gold coins and 2 boxes of gold ingots, valued at 1.2 million rubles. Colonel Izome signed a receipt. That receipt became the basis for decades of litigation. General Petrov spent years attempting to recover the gold. Semenov and General Potyagin sued Japanese banks for 60,000 yen that remained in Japanese accounts. In 1933, Petrov traveled to Japan personally, presenting authority from General Mikhail Dietrichs to pursue the claim. The Japanese courts accepted the case. They delayed proceedings through the 1930s and into World War II. Petrov eventually settled. During the war, he agreed to renounce all claims in exchange for the Japanese government paying his accumulated legal expenses. The gold remained in Japan. Semenov fared worse. After Japanese defeat in 1945, Soviet military counterintelligence arrested him in Manchuria. His trial began on August 26, 1946. On August 30th, the court found him guilty of anti-Soviet agitation, espionage, sabotage, and terrorism. He was hanged in Moscow at 11 p.m. that same evening. In 2004, the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs acknowledged receiving 55 boxes of gold from Russian sources during the Civil War period. At current valuations, analysts estimate the transferred gold's worth at no less than $10 billion. Compound that figure with interest over 100 years, and the sum becomes difficult to calculate. Russia has made no formal claim for the return of this gold. The 1917 gold dispersal created a template. The template shows what happens when sovereign wealth is stored abroad during geopolitical instability. The template shows how foreign banks absorb deposits and decline to return them when regimes change. The template shows how physical gold, once moved across borders, becomes subject to local law rather than international obligation. The Russian government learned from this template. Between 2014 and 2022, Russia reduced its holdings of U.S. Treasury securities from over $150 billion to less than $4 billion. It accumulated physical gold within Russian borders. By 2022, Russia held over 2,300 tons of gold in domestic vaults. This was a deliberate strategy to create reserves that could not be frozen by foreign governments. The strategy proved partially effective and partially flawed. In February 2022, following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Western nations froze approximately $300 billion in Russian central bank foreign exchange reserves. Most of these assets were held in European financial institutions, particularly in Belgium through the Euroclear settlement system. Russia could not access this money. The freeze demonstrated that digital reserves held in foreign jurisdictions remain vulnerable to political decisions by host countries. The gold held domestically remained untouchable by sanctions. Russia could sell it to willing buyers, primarily China and the United Arab Emirates. According to reports from early 2026, Russia sold 300,000 ounces of gold in January alone, earning up to $1.68 billion as prices reached record highs. The country used gold sales to cover budget shortfalls caused by sanctions and military expenditure. The parallel to 1917 is structural rather than exact. Kolchak deposited gold in foreign banks as collateral for weapons. Those deposits were never recovered. Modern Russia held foreign exchange reserves in Western banks for portfolio management. Those reserves were frozen overnight when political conditions changed. In both cases, sovereign wealth stored outside domestic control became inaccessible when the host nations decided to deny access. The lesson has not been lost on other governments. Central banks globally have increased gold purchases since 2022. They recognize that physical bullion stored within their own borders cannot be sanctioned, frozen, or confiscated by foreign powers. The 1917 dispersal and the 2022 freeze both teach the same principle. The only assets you control are the ones you hold. The missing 200 million gold rubles from 1917 were worth roughly $4 billion in modern terms. That figure represents the unaccounted gap between what left Kazan and what the Bolsheviks eventually received. Some of it financed foreign arms manufacturers. Some of it may rest at the bottom of Lake Baikal. Some of it funded Czech banks. Some of it enriched Japanese vaults. Some of it disappeared into the pockets of soldiers, guards, and officials who saw chaos as opportunity. The 300 billion frozen in 2022 dwarfs that sum. The legal debates about whether those frozen assets should be confiscated to support Ukraine reconstruction echo century-old questions about the disposition of sovereign wealth during wartime. By December 2025, the European Union decided to keep roughly $246 billion in Russian central bank assets frozen indefinitely. In March 2026, the Russian central bank commenced legal proceedings before the EU General Court challenging the legality of the freeze. The litigation will continue for years. General Petrov's lawsuit against Japanese banks lasted until World War II ended any hope of resolution. The current legal battles over frozen Russian assets could extend for decades. History does not repeat, but financial structures persist. The mechanisms that allowed Japan to retain Russian gold for a century are the same mechanisms that allow Western banks to hold Russian reserves today. Legal frameworks favor the holder. Possession creates leverage. International law provides process, but rarely delivers restitution. The 1311 tons of gold that the Russian Empire possessed in 1914 represented more than monetary value. It represented the stored labor of millions of workers in Russian mines. It represented decades of trade surpluses and careful accumulation. It represented national capacity, independent of foreign credit or international goodwill. When that gold scattered, Russia lost more than money. It lost the cushion that allows a state to absorb shocks, to finance transitions, to maintain independence during crisis. The Bolsheviks eventually rebuilt reserves through their own extraction and accumulation. The process took decades. Modern Russia faces a similar trajectory. The frozen assets represent years of petroleum exports and careful central bank management. If those assets never return, Russia will need decades to rebuild equivalent reserves through domestic accumulation. The gold trains of 1917 carried the wealth of an empire along tracks that still exist today. The Trans-Siberian Railroad still runs from Moscow to Vladivostok. Tourists still ride the Circumbaikal line, where legend says treasure trains plunged into the water. The vaults of Japanese banks still hold gold that may have originated in Russian mines. The ledgers of history remain incomplete. What disappeared between 1917 and 1920 taught every subsequent generation of Russian leaders a lesson they have never forgotten. Store your wealth where you control it. Trust no foreign institution with resources essential to national survival. Gold in your vault is yours. Gold in someone else's vault belongs to whoever holds the keys. The roughly $4 billion in missing gold from 1917 seems modest compared to modern financial figures, but in 1917 that sum would have financed an army for years. It would have purchased foreign recognition and diplomatic support. It would have provided the margin between victory and defeat in a civil war. The Czech Legion traded Kolchak and 409 million rubles for safe passage home. They made the rational calculation. The gold was worth less to them than their lives. The Bolsheviks made a rational calculation too. The gold was worth less than the risk of continued conflict with 70,000 armed soldiers controlling key railroad junctions. Semenov made his own calculation. Gold deposited with Japanese allies would finance his continued war. When the war ended, the Allies kept the deposit. The receipt signed by Colonel Isom became a worthless scrap of paper. Every calculation made sense to the person making it. The cumulative result was the most documented financial disappearance in modern history. Documented because records exist for most transactions. Disappearance because the gold never returned to Russian state control. You live in a world still shaped by these events. The debates about frozen Russian assets in 2026 are direct descendants of the debates about Kolchak's gold a century ago. The principles have not changed. The sums have grown larger. The technology has evolved from gold ingots to digital ledger entries. The vulnerability remains identical. Sovereign wealth stored abroad exists at the pleasure of foreign governments. This was true in 1917. It was true in 2022. It will remain true as long as nations depend on each other for financial infrastructure. The only hedge against this vulnerability is physical possession of physical assets within borders you control. Russia learned this lesson. Other nations are learning it now. The ghost of the Imperial gold reserve haunts every central banker who considers where to store national wealth. The lesson cost Russia 1,311 tons of gold to learn. It cost them another $300 billion to remember. The search for the missing gold continues. Submersibles explore Lake Baikal. Historians comb through archives in Prague, Tokyo, and Moscow. Treasure hunters follow legends into Siberian forests. They search for gold that may no longer exist, spent long ago on bullets and uniforms that turn to rust. What remains is the lesson. The lesson is worth more than the gold ever was.